4 gunshots exploded into a crowd of people saying goodbye to someone they loved. 100 mourners gathered to honor a boy whose life had been stolen far too early. A stolen vehicle already speeding away into darkness before anyone even started screaming. The time was just past 6 p.m. on a freezing Friday evening during February 2023. Inside a church hall located on Hampstead Road in Handsworth, Birmingham, an entire community had come together to grieve. Several people had traveled right across the city just to be present. Every single person had arrived to participate in the most fundamentally human act possible, mourning someone they'd lost. Outside, as darkness settled around them, a man sat pulling gloves onto his hands in a stolen Nissan Qashqai's rear seat. He'd completed every single preparation necessary to ensure nobody could prove he'd been at the scene of what was about to unfold. False license plates covered the stolen car. A loaded pistol already rested in his grip. Meshach Bryman was his name, 21 years old. And mourning wasn't why he'd come. He'd come because he possessed intelligence that rival gang members would be gathered inside that church hall. He'd come because within the violent world he existed in, within the active street war raging between 2 of Birmingham's deadliest gangs, that intelligence didn't represent a reason for showing restraint. It represented an opportunity worth exploiting. And Bryman squeezed the trigger. Smash that subscribe button for cold files unlocked immediately. This represents the story of Meshach Bryman and the church hall shooting at Akeem Bailey's memorial service. 4 gunshots discharged into 100 grieving people at St. Mary's Church Hall in Handsworth. 3 young men struck by bullets. 1 14-year-old girl crushed in the panicked stampede, subsequently diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. We're examining the violent street war between armed response and 9 boys, 2 criminal gangs whose mutual hatred had already claimed lives. About Akeem Bailey, a completely innocent 17-year-old murdered during a mobile phone dispute, whose memorial gathering transformed into a target. About Meshach Bryman's calculated planning, the stolen vehicle, false registration plates, abandoned mobile phone, and gloves contaminated with gunshot residue. About the criminal trial lasting 3 weeks that concluded with 3 unanimous guilty verdicts for attempted murder. And about the life imprisonment sentence with a 24-year minimum term imposed on a 21-year-old who demonstrated absolutely zero remorse. Activate those notifications right this instant, because this case powerfully demonstrates how gang violence transforms memorial services into hunting grounds, how Birmingham's street wars devour innocent lives completely, and how one individual's determination to murder nearly transformed into mass slaughter. The gangs' war in Birmingham's streets. To genuinely comprehend what erupted outside St. Mary's Church Hall during the evening of February 24, 2023, you absolutely must understand the 2 criminal gangs whose bitter hatred generated it. An armed response emerged during the early 2000s from North Birmingham's urban streets, Handsworth, Lozells, the densely packed corridors of terraced housing and council estates that had been generating gang conflict throughout this city for multiple decades. They constructed their identity around drill music, recording videos, posting them to YouTube, threatening rival organizations by name through lyrics and online comment sections. The physical streets and the digital internet for these criminal groups function as one continuous combat zone. During 2016, West Midlands Police arrested a 20-year-old individual affiliated with Armed Response who'd been broadcasting the gang's criminal activity to thousands of online viewers. publishing videos where he blatantly glorified shootings and deliberately provoked his rivals. In one particular video, the rapper identified as Lynch could be heard graphically describing attacks on competing groups in explicit detail. He received a 27-year prison sentence for his involvement in a sustained wave of violence that had left 8 individuals suffering gunshot wounds throughout Birmingham, including a 16-year-old boy shot in the back outside a barbecue gathering. The videos remained accessible online long after Lynch entered prison. They got watched, internalized, and studied carefully by the generation emerging after him. That subsequent generation didn't become calmer. During November 2021, 4 armed response members actively hunted a 13-year-old boy through an underpass at Hawksley Circus in Birmingham. The boy had committed no offense. He'd simply walked onto territory that armed response had arbitrarily claimed as theirs. CCTV footage captured a stolen vehicle screeching to an abrupt halt beside him. The men exited. They pursued him through the underpass. One individual fired a homemade slam gun, 2 segments of metal pipe crudely welded together, primitive yet deadly, and struck the boy directly in the spine. He survived the attack. He'll never completely recover. He became paralyzed. He was 13 years old. Following the shooting, one perpetrator returned home and produced a drill music video expressing his regret, not for shooting the child, but for failing to actually kill him. He subsequently received a life sentence. That same year, during a separate incident, armed response members appeared at a Birmingham nightclub where a rapper from a competing gang called Goon Squad Army was performing live. The instant one of their members spotted him performing on stage, the violence erupted. A bottle got thrown. An armed response member drew a knife and lunged toward the rapper, an individual named Ricardo Reed, performing under the name Stardom, and only missed his target because he slipped, providing Reed barely enough time to escape through a fire exit. 6 men were ultimately convicted for what transpired that night. This represented armed response throughout the years preceding February 2023. Bold, habitual, completely unconcerned about consequences. And they weren't the only criminal organization operating. 9 Boyz controlled the identical North Birmingham geography. Lozells, Aston, Chainwalk. They trafficked drugs, controlled street-level dealers, and constructed their identity around the identical drill music culture, the identical performance of menace. Like armed response, they recorded themselves. Like armed response, they conducted their business extremely publicly. And like armed response, they'd accumulated enemies at some specific point, through a violent confrontation, through a killing, through one of those critical moments that ignite these conflicts and rarely get fully disclosed during court proceedings. 9 Boyz and armed response found themselves engaged in war with each other. By the time February 2023 arrived, that war possessed an official designation inside Birmingham Crown Court. Prosecutor Lisa Hancock utilized it plainly when opening the prosecution case against Meshach Bryman. She labeled it an ongoing street war. Within that violent context, every gathering of enemy members represented an opportunity worth exploiting. Even a memorial service. Share in the comments where globally you're watching from, because what unfolded next is absolutely devastating. The victim, Akeem's innocent life. Before Meshach Bryman ever squeezed that trigger, before the stolen Nissan turned onto Hampstead Road, before any subsequent events occurred, there existed a 17-year-old boy named Akeem Bailey, who departed to meet someone during a Sunday afternoon in Ladywood and never returned home. During the evening of October 30th, 2022, Akeem was discovered suffering serious stab wounds on Springfield Street in Ladywood, several miles from Handsworth. He'd been stabbed directly in the neck, then he was transported to hospital and placed into an induced coma. West Midlands Police, even during that early stage, recognized his injuries were unsurvivable. Their assessment proved accurate. On Friday, November 4th, 2022, 5 days following the attack, Akeem Bailey died. He was 17 years old. An individual named Zechariah Nelson, then 18, was charged with his murder. The trial that followed heard evidence that Nelson had brought a knife to an arranged meeting, whatever that meeting concerned, and the jury was informed it had originated as a dispute over a mobile phone. It concluded with Akeem Bailey lying on the ground and Nelson fleeing the scene. Nelson was ultimately convicted, not of murder charges, but of manslaughter and wounding. He received a life sentence with an 11-year minimum term. The court was explicitly told that Akeem Bailey possessed absolutely zero gang connections. This wasn't a death arising from gang warfare. This wasn't a targeted assassination of an enemy. It represented, in the manner that countless of these deaths do, the destruction of an innocent life through the type of casual violence that occurs when knives are ubiquitous and tensions escalate, and young men make irreversible decisions in moments. Akeem possessed a brother. His brother maintained an affiliation with Armed Response, but Akeem himself wasn't involved in that world whatsoever. The judge who would subsequently sentence Meshach Bryman emphasized this point with unusual intensity. He needed to, because by the time of Bryman's trial, Akeem Bailey had transformed into background context for someone else's violence. His memorial service, a tactical opportunity within a gang war he possessed zero involvement in. The court wouldn't permit that characterization. Judge Melbourne, Inman KC, proved explicit and unambiguous. Akeem Bailey represented a wholly innocent victim, a child who was murdered. A boy whose death deserved to be mourned without being weaponized for gang purposes. His family organized his wake for the evening of February 24, 2023, nearly 4 months following his death. They selected St. Mary's Church Hall on Hampstead Road in Handsworth. They invited the people who had genuinely loved him. Approximately 100 people attended. Some possessed connections to Armed Response. Some possessed none. All had arrived to accomplish the identical thing, to say their final goodbye. But what they couldn't have possibly known was that Akeem's brother's gang connection had transformed their gathering into a target. That somewhere across the city, during the days preceding the wake, Meshach Bryman had learned that Armed Response members would be present. And that learning this intelligence, he'd decided to take action. If this devastating story has you completely captivated, smash that like button immediately. The shooter, Bryman's violent path. Meshach Bryman was born into the identical North Birmingham landscape that had been producing young men resembling him for 40 years. He grew up in Lozells on Chain Walk, a street located within walking distance of the church hall, where he would eventually discharge a firearm into a crowd of mourners. His childhood, his defense barrister would inform the court, and was one fundamentally defined by deprivation and parental absence. He got removed from mainstream education during a young age and placed into a pupil referral unit, the type of institution that too frequently functions not as a support lifeline but as a sorting mechanism. The barrister characterized this as maximizing his isolation, intensifying the downward spiral toward wrong associations, wrong loyalties, wrong life path. Police footage of his residence, displayed in court, depicted conditions his own barrister labelled squalid. Not the sort of environment, Earl Pinnock informed the court, that would foster hope. Not the sort of place any of us would want our children to be brought up in. These represent genuine facts. They exist alongside other genuine facts and don't cancel them out. By the time he reached his teenage years, as Bryman was already deeply involved in the drug trade, by 2021, he appeared before Worcester Crown Court for drug dealing and received a 2-year suspended sentence. The countdown on that sentence began. He served it within the community, and it expired. 12 days before the shooting at Akeem Bailey's wake, Meshach Bryman's suspended sentence concluded. 12 days. Whatever the legal system had hoped that supervision period might accomplish, some behavioral change, some life redirection, some pulling back from the precipice, it hadn't proven sufficient. He was already back deeply involved in the drug trade. When West Midlands Police eventually executed a search warrant at his Chain Walk address, they discovered crack cocaine, heroin and cannabis with a combined street value reaching into thousands of pounds. They discovered weighing scales. They discovered a knuckle duster and a machete. They discovered a mobile phone whose text messages detailed his operation in clinical detail. Cutting, packaging, supplying, controlling street-level dealers. This wasn't small-scale or casual activity. This was an individual operating a business, and that business was drugs. The court was additionally shown something else. Drill rap videos uploaded to the internet and publicly accessible, featuring Meshach Bryman. In these videos, he threatened to shoot and murder his rivals, explicitly, on camera, for absolutely anyone to observe. Within the logic of the drill world, this represented a form of currency. Within the logic of a Crown Court trial, it represented evidence. And then on February 24th, 2023, he stopped performing it on camera and executed it in person. The planning, calculated preparation. The preparation commenced before the Nissan Qashqai moved. Bryman didn't act impulsively during the evening of the wake. He didn't drive past St. Mary's Church Hall by chance and make a spontaneous decision. The attack, prosecutors argued, was meticulously planned. It required intelligence, that armed response members would be attending the wake, intelligence about the location and timing of the gathering, intelligence about the route to take and the escape route away. It required a stolen vehicle, one already equipped with false plates so that the ANPR cameras monitoring every major road throughout Birmingham couldn't read it and connect it to anything. It required a weapon, a smooth-barreled 9mm pistol, and the ammunition to load it. And it required a level of operational awareness that speaks to experience, to having executed this type of thing previously, or at minimum, to having learned from those who had. During the afternoon of the shooting, Bryman departed his residence on Chain Walk and walked to Summercroft, where the stolen Nissan waited. Before entering the car, he handed his mobile phone to another gang member. No phone meant no location data pinging off cell towers, no GPS trail, no digital record of his movements. He removed his jacket, leaving it behind so there would be no fibers, no forensic trace of him in the vehicle that could connect him to what was about to happen. Then he pulled gloves onto his hands. He was methodical. He was prepared. And the judge would later characterize what followed as a determined attempt to murder a number of people. That determination didn't begin at the moment of firing. It began here, in the quiet afternoon, in the practical business of ensuring he could kill and not get caught. The Nissan moved toward Handsworth. toward St. Mary's Church Hall, toward 100 people who had gathered to grieve. The shooting, chaos, and terror. The time was shortly after 6 p.m. when the Nissan Qashqai turned onto Hampstead Road. The Nissan executed one pass, slow, deliberate. CCTV cameras positioned throughout the area captured what happened next, and that footage would subsequently be shown to the jury at Birmingham Crown Court. You can observe the car, you can observe it moving, you can observe it turn, and then it returned. From the rear passenger seat, then Meshach Bryman raised the pistol and discharged 4 shots into the crowd, 4 shots into a gathering of 100 people at a wake. The judge, who would subsequently sentence him, stated that it was remarkable that one or more of them were not killed. Remarkable was the precise word he utilized, and it represents the accurate word because the gap between what occurred that evening and a mass killing was nothing beyond the particular trajectory of 4 bullets, the specific positions of 100 bodies in a moment of chaos. The panic proved instant and total. People scattered in absolutely every direction. They threw themselves through doors. They dove behind cars. They collided with each other in the desperate, instinctive rush away from the sound of gunfire. The judge would label it a scene of utter terror. And that phrase, and clinical as it sounds, captures something genuine. Terror isn't merely fear. 3 young men were struck. A 19-year-old, connected to armed response, prosecutors stated, was shot in the chest, the bullet passing through his left arm as it entered. His ribs were broken. His lung was damaged. He required surgery to have the bullet removed. That's not a minor injury. That's not something you recover from and forget. That's a level of violence that permanently changes the architecture of a body. A second 19-year-old, also associated with armed response, was struck in his left foot. A third young man, 18 years old, was shot in the shin. He possessed no known connection to either gang. He had attended the wake for the identical reason everyone else had. He would spend 5 months unable to leave the sofa as his body attempted to heal. He informed the court that he still struggled to walk, and he stated something in his victim impact statement that deserves to be repeated in full because it represents the truest summary of what that evening cost him. "I don't like leaving the house. I'd rather stay in at home because I don't want to die. Anywhere you go, something bad can happen. I was at my best friend's funeral and got shot. Anything can happen." A 14-year-old girl was hurt in the stampede, knocked over and trampled as the crowd fled. She didn't take a bullet, but the court heard from her mother that she came home from that evening a fundamentally different person. She was subsequently diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. She was no longer comfortable in crowded places. She flinched at loud sounds. Much she had gone to say goodbye to her friend, and came home carrying a trauma that wouldn't leave her. The Nissan Qashqai accelerated away from the church hall, turned, and disappeared. The following day, it was discovered abandoned 2 miles away in Little Francis Grove, Nichelles. By then, Bryman had already moved on. The investigation and trial. Evidence mounts. West Midlands Police's major crime team arrived at a scene that was both chaotic and, crucially, exceptionally well documented. CCTV cameras had captured the pass, the turn, and the shooting. The footage wasn't ambiguous. The car was visible. The direction of shots was clear. The moment the crowd scattered was there on tape for anyone to watch. But cameras show cars, not faces. Linking the shooter to the act required more. Detective Inspector Francis Knock led the investigation. The work that followed over the coming weeks was meticulous. The abandoned Nissan was examined. The clothes Bryman had been wearing, recovered separately through the investigation, were examined. Cell site data from mobile phones in the area was analyzed. The ANPR network, which automatically logs vehicle movements across Birmingham's road network, was interrogated. Witnesses were interviewed. And then there were the gloves. The pair of gloves Bryman had put on before getting into the car were recovered and submitted for testing. The results came back positive for gunshot residue in the specific formulation consistent with the discharge of a smooth-barreled 9mm pistol, the type of pistol that had been used on Hampstead Road. On March 21, 2023, less than 4 weeks after the shooting, officers executed a search warrant at Bryman's address on Chain Walk. What they found there confirmed what they already suspected: the drugs, the weapons, the phone messages, the drill videos. Everything that had defined his life before he got into that Nissan was sitting in his home, waiting to be catalogued and handed to a prosecution team. Bryman was arrested. He answered no comment to every question put to him in police interview. He later wrote a letter in which he continued to deny any involvement in the shooting. A letter the judge would cite at sentencing as evidence that, despite everything, Bryman still had not found the capacity for remorse. The trial of Meshach Bryman opened at Birmingham Crown Court in the autumn of 2024 and lasted 3 weeks. He faced 3 counts of attempted murder. He denied all of them. The prosecution's case was methodical and thorough. The jury saw the CCTV footage from Hampstead Road. They heard from forensic experts about the gun residue on the gloves. They heard from cell site analysts about Bryman's movements on the evening of February 24th. They heard about the false plates on the stolen Nissan, the discarded phone, the jacket left behind, the systematic elimination of evidence by a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Prosecutor Lisa Hancock stood and reminded the court of the impact on the victims: the 19-year-old with the damaged lung and the surgically removed bullet, the 18-year-old still fighting to walk, the 14-year-old girl diagnosed with PTSD. The defense, led by Earl Pinnock, put Bryman's background before the jury: the pupil referral unit, the impoverished upbringing, the squalid home, the structural failures that had channeled him toward the life he was now in the dock for. These were not invented arguments. These were real circumstances, documented and real. Pinnock argued that his client had been shaped by an environment that gave him no alternative, no foothold, no legitimate path. The jury considered the evidence. They returned a unanimous verdict: guilty. 3 counts of attempted murder, all 3. Bryman had already, before the trial began, admitted to possessing crack cocaine, heroin, and cannabis with intent to supply. Now, with the attempted murder verdicts returned, the full picture of who he was and what he had done was on the court record. He was taken down to await sentencing. Sentencing, justice, and hope. On January 31st, 2025, Meshach Bryman was brought to the dock at Birmingham Crown Court to be sentenced. It had been nearly 2 years since the shooting. Nearly 2 years since a crowd of mourners had been forced to run for their lives in what should have been, above all else, a moment of peace. Judge Melbourne Inman Key C, the recorder of Birmingham, addressed the defendant. He did not minimize what Bryman's barrister had said about his background. He acknowledged the difficult upbringing, the limited education, the immaturity. He heard all of it, and he sat with it. But acknowledgement and mitigation are not the same thing, and the judge was clear about where the weight of the evidence fell. Sadly, this is yet another case of very serious violence involving the use of firearms between street gangs within this city, he told the court. Now, gang violence is a scourge of this city, as it is elsewhere. He named the attack for what it was: planned, deliberate, a decision made in advance to take a weapon to a funeral and fire it into a crowd of people who were there to grieve. He reminded the court that Akeem Bailey, the boy whose wake had been turned into a hunting ground, was wholly innocent. Not a gang member, not a combatant, a murdered child whose memory had been used by Bryman as a tool of operational intelligence. He turned to the question of remorse. Bryman had written a letter from custody, continuing to deny involvement in the shooting. Despite the CCTV, the forensics, the phone data, the guilty verdicts returned by the jury, he had still not found it within himself to acknowledge what he had done. The judge concluded he had shown no remorse whatsoever. And then came the assessment that sealed the sentence. Bryman had a deep involvement in gang culture. He represented a very grave danger to the public. The attack had been a determined attempt to murder a number of people, multiple people at a funeral, and had demonstrated that he had, in the judge's words, no regard at all for human life. A life sentence was not just appropriate, it was necessary. Meshach Bryman was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 24 years. He will be in his mid-40s before he can even apply for parole. The smooth-barreled 9mm pistol he fired 4 times into a crowd of mourners has still never been found. Meshach Bryman is in prison, where the minimum term will count down across decades. The 9 Boyz and armed response street war did not end with his conviction. Street wars do not end when one combatant is jailed. They pause, they shift, they find new faces and new occasions and new targets. The geography does not change. The economics do not change. The exclusions and deprivations that produce young men willing to fire guns at funerals do not change because one of those young men received a life sentence. What changes things is harder to achieve and slower to arrive. It requires the kind of sustained, funded, serious investment in communities like Handsworth and Lozells and Aston that this country has consistently failed to provide. It requires schools that hold on to the young people who need them most, rather than excluding them into pupil referral units where their isolation deepens and their options narrow. It requires something more than law enforcement picking up the pieces after the violence has already happened. None of that is Meshach Bryman's defense. He made choices, he prepared, he pulled on the gloves, he picked up the gun, and he fired it into a crowd of people at a child's wake. He showed no remorse. But justice for the perpetrator is not the same thing as justice for the victims. And justice for the victims is not the same thing as justice for the community. And a community that keeps producing this, that keeps burying its children and filling its courtrooms and watching its wakes become crime scenes, deserves more than life sentences and a judge calling gang violence a scourge. It deserves the thing that has always been harder to deliver. It deserves hope. Subscribe to Cold Files Unlocked for more UK true crime cases covered with detail and respect. Hit that like button if this story moved you. Turn on notifications for more investigations. Drop your thoughts in the comments. What will it actually take to break Birmingham's cycle of gang violence? This case reminds us that gang violence weaponizes grief, that innocent lives are caught in crossfire, and that 100 people coming to mourn became 100 targets. For Akeem Bailey, whose memory was violated. For the victims who carry physical and psychological scars. For a community crying out for hope. Thanks for watching. Stay Stay safe out there.